Welcome to week 5, a continuation and integrative response, psychological response to transformational psychology. The direction of the person's growth in God and in relationship to oneself must be fundamental in doing psychology. At this produces a systematic body of knowledge and reflection in psychology. Personal goodness, seeing oneself in truth and being open to one's observation in God and others is generally being rightly related to what is real. As it is at a crucial point to producing a thoughtful and existential body of knowledge. This is an understanding of the human nature for the sake of the world and the church. Psychologically unhealthy results from potential binders and prejudices, defenses, and abilities are certain elements of reality to painful or psychologically beyond psychological study. The foreseen advances in the ultimate product are transforming the psychologist into the image of Christ, as in the very act of doing psychology. The spiritual and ethical epistemology thesis becomes clear. In doing psychology in a particular way, both possible and pragmatic. This depends on the goodness of observation in investigating human nature. Psychologists are free to observe or reflect theories well or poor and dishonest or honest, but must have the ability to do psychology and understand the person. This is partly determined by what kind of person the observer is as he observes a person. One's character, health, or lack of health is one's ability to participate in the actuality of a person's personhood as they see the effect on what the person can see. The journey in union with God and conformity to Christ's character is not the ultimate object or gain of doing psychology, but the forming factor of doing psychology well. The business of a Christian's experiential growth is the foundation or developing a deeply unified conception of doing psychology well for psychotherapy of helping others. The reason this logically is clear within the Christian faith is escaping modernism, namely in the aspects of holiness and spiritual health. This preserves the person with all honesty to remain open to the reality of human nature as they see sin as not in a sort of distort what remains real and true about human beings. This is understood with in the process of life as psychological health, but that does not guarantee person's research praxis will be excellent psychology. However, this does not protect the psychological scientist from distorting one's enthusiasm. Personal psychology may be limited in the horizon of human experience, but it results in potential cutoff in observations, reflections of theorizing. There is a danger in psychology when a party invested or shows interest in misinterprets and a misinterpretation of understanding a person's whereabouts in the sense of mind and thought. God exists, then the atheist psychologists are necessary screwing dimensions of the human experience by ignoring or explaining away the supernatural belief in God. They, at best, review God talk to merely be representations of rational or interrealization of experience of others, although the same can be said of believers who close themselves off to reality. That takes in a relationship between God and others. It may be dishonest to research ego aggradations which move to be theorized by unwarranted dogmatism. Though what is adherent to theory, despite evidence or lack of theory thereof in various realities, often become limited in the horizon of theorizing what is true for non-Christians and Christians. The reason for such a dogma is a person's tendency to distort the truth for such observance within any methodology. With this, there seems to be a human habitual liking towards self-deception. Hopefully, this universalizing of one's experience onto the world and its possible horizon does not limit what is real and true. If a Christian doing psychology has little or no conscious of experiencing the Spirit, it is possible they lack the union with the Holy Spirit. This lack of experience may become a limited horizon on their experience and theory about the human understanding in relationship to God. There is an overplay with psychology as in the rule of human rationality, but a trained Christian may change the naturalistic approach in cognitive systems. Modernism is not always open to the Spirit and the role of demon, prayer, and discernment with the Spirit or spiritual discipline. It can be said psychologists who experience the Holy Spirit's presence through prayer may be more sensitive to understand. Also, be able to explore the experience with theory and research. This understanding may also help their believing clients. Psychologists who remain open to understanding humanity in a relationship to Christ and others may be well suited for understanding what is occurring in the mind of humans. We must look at this phenomenon for what it is. with the need to distort or reduce another less phenomenon. Modernism may lack understanding in reality due to error or lack of effort, being blinded by psychotherapy realities. In all cases, it is not healthy and dysfunctional of the psychologist, but it is in their experience or lack of their interpersonal existent component. Knowing this, it is important in doing psychology in the spirit within the methodology component, as well as the good theorizing of the theoretical product or its component thereof. It is especially for the psychologist not to veer from what is true, because the maximum should expand to be truly healthy in regard to true health. Only psychologists who experience a good range of psychology knows the truth and health and its boundaries. Without this knowing, things become undone, missing the finer points of psychological theory. Not dealing with fear, anger, guilt, shame, and the need of the spirit facts may be distorted. A non-Christian ability to discover truth will be limited to impartial pathology. The difference in Christian psychology is a relationship with Jesus Christ, giving Christians the proper way in which to assist. Pursuing psychology means loving God and neighbors and discovering the nature of humanity that an unbeliever may not see. This may not always ensure being a believer makes for good psychology, but in the fact a Christian psychologist may be limited by unwillingness or inability due to understanding psychotherapy. The spiritual discipline applied by science and having a personal relationship with God, as such teaching lies in the essential teachings of Christ that fosters a union with God. This makes the psychologist's character a foundation for their openness to reality, as such spiritual disciplines of character is linked to transformational psychology in doing psychology within theoretical or psychological methodology. In this, there is a learning spiral between doing psychology and therapy within any spiritual discipline, because in doing psychology spiritually protects the psychologist from doing psychological therapy without the insight of spiritual discipline. This should be the practice within open and honest confession of sin as within humanity, so as to help psychologists from distorting the truth in ignorance. Modernism ethos may preclude this from happening, but it is crucial that correction for the Christian does not fail. Change is on the horizon for Christians, standing grounded in healthy models that are faith-based. Some have found better insight into neuroscience, attaching it to faith and transformational psychology. For the Christian, this means healthy existence or existential model in developing psychology which is transformed by the Spirit. In the book reading, you will read 5 levels of transformational psychology. At its first, explains the logical flow and character of science and the Spirit. Second is the process that protects and maintains spiritual psychology. Third is the method of dynamic laws that give wisdom to psychology and its health and dysfunctional understanding. Fourth is the transformation that draws one closer to loving God with a vision of better psychology. The fifth is the understanding and theory of loving God and the nature of psychology. The history and new transformative models or methods of doing psychology can be imagined by transforming methods that transform how one does psychology. Some people have an ambitious agenda in redefying transformational psychology in a way of thinking of psychology in relation to Christianity. This may rethink the very nature of psychology, science, in a bold wish to transform psychology scientifically into something intrinsically singular in the act of faith and love. The way to accomplish this is to set off on a course to re-experience or redesign the process of doing psychology to its finished product. Though it may be unclear what this new science looks like, finding out triggers it seems or is seen in three thoughts. First of which shows psychological science as one new knowledge and insight in transformational psychology as it proceeds. Second is the Christian's origin in the modern scientific approach as it appears to appreciate and respect modern science. John Calvin may have offered a model for secular psychology that scholars today can find in saying, praiseworthy, ultimately coming from God. Thirdly, although it may be right in psychological science, it merits a critique, which perhaps has a modest agenda that would be appropriated. The witness of history and the Bible shows people or persons of faith as fallible creatures. The reign of truth and illusion falls on realities of faith, redeeming the possibility of doing psychology. This is done according to the reality and not merely the dictates of one's fantasies. This is done in such a way that it brings about eternal and external truth. Coe and Hall go on to say that giving a more definition to transformational psychology, although some Christians may disagree with them, their view of immaterial human spirit as entail on faith rooted in part should be part of any new psychology. One could confer with the astounding answer of yes in saying Christian realities is the experience of immaterial objects that are excluded in modern science. It is stated that many Christian scholars have offered biblical-based understanding of humanity, but this may not necessarily embody creatures whose existence is not rooted in essential immaterial nature. This is rather seen in God's promise of a body being resurrected. Scholars at Fuller Theological Seminary explain that biblical faith is much closer to today's cognitive neuroscience than a Platomatic immaterial soul. Coe and Hall look at transformational psychology as doing something other than psychology, as we see that non-nationalist scientists are non-science, as in contraction of the truth, which contradicts its true realities. It is better to respect faith as faith and science as science, but then build bridges between science and faith. Coe and Hall offer human need to belong and Christianity's assumption that life is rational. Coe and Hall try to explain to secular psychology why a non-believer cannot fully do psychology, but need also explain transformational psychology superior in the study of memory formation. This also includes cognitive changes with age, color, vision, genetics or personality, and intelligence. Hemispheric processing, biochemistry of orders, and thousands of other topics within the realm of psychological science investigating human nature. One can appreciate Coe and Hall's efforts in weaving scientific and spiritual understanding into a harmonious fabric, but it is a respectful orthodox that may have a foundation, as many can agree upon, and is transformational psychology into faith. Christians cannot transform Christianity into New Age thinking without regard to its historical meaning. Some of the psychological pathways in Christian psychology are well intended, even though the education discussed are biased in the world of secular psychology, putting off faith in the corner. The focus of Christian psychology is where conservative Christian talk among themselves as a pathway takes us into fields of mainstream psychology, where worship of God with our minds, our hearts, can enthusiastically be used as tools of science in exploring human nature while being part of God's substance of quality. As for most Christians, the chosen path is not a particular enclave, as Christian scholars aim to be true and do what is true. To be true in observing reality and one's own value, one may be called to follow biblical tradition. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 9:20-23, we are not part of the world, but the Jews, we are a Jew, and to the Greeks, we are a Greek. There is much to comprehend in forming the description of transformational psychology in viewing relationships between Christianity and psychology. The most important feature in this approach is evident in its clear and committed process to biblical authority. Such authority should be fundamentally grounded in biblical view of people and indeed to all reality. Christians can be articulate and clear in their commitment to crucial or critical reality in realism, which affirms the object of reality as it exists in independent perception of our view of realism. Such a view of realism is engaged and comes through knowing that the objective reality, though traditional or worldly in its viewpoints, is crucial realism. Transformational psychologists seek a single unified or complex psychological science that goal is shared by the integrated approach to psychology. It is said that the clear willingness of Ko and Hall is to engage and learn contributing factors in all forms of psychology. The embraces of the Old Testament sage for an appropriate model that illuminates or emulates an encouragement of the use of classical spiritual disciplines. The pursuit of spiritual transformative psychology is more broad in its foundation for Christian psychology. Christian psychology identifies love as the final or appropriate end of all aspects for its efforts in transformational psychology. Ko and Hall's goal is to provide general outlines or contours for this transformational model, but the Christian focus should be what distinguishes a model that concerns itself with distinguishing points despite its commendable qualities. Ko and Hall seek to differentiate models from older models, labeling our views that are sharply yet distinct. In the integrational view, it is distorted characterization as the integration view as a consequence becomes limited. The aspect described in the integrational view as relational of two separate kinds of study that involves two kinds of methodology, it is clear and exclusive. For the believer, it is a matter of fact that brings together its own particular methodology, but Ko and Hall argue that transformational psychology implicitly in its concepts contrasts the integrational view not relating to theology or science. This becomes clear in the reference to integrational view, and that shows psychology and science in general with faith. It is not about to be separate in its realities, to be brought together by some subsequent or non-scientific methodology. However, it is not the integrated methodology that is in question here, but the unflattering description of it. Some integrationists have called for more holistic reconstruction of psychology. Christians must be aware of the overdependency of tradition, but should be set off on a course to re-experience or redesign the processes of psychology in relation to modernism. A Christian goal should be a generation that does psychology in the spirit, which allows reality and faith to shape its psychological endeavor. The author of the book in our course study argues for rational rethinking of the very nature of psychology, in contrast that both religious and non-religious have argued in a courageous paradiagram, which is standard, average, or norm. Christian psychologists individualism and settling aside prior wisdom within psychology is a breathtaking scope, because such a transformative model of psychology is the determination or determinative element in the process of the product of doing psychology. This emphasis is the reiteration found in a lot of including psychologists who identify the first act of transformational psychology that transforms a person fundamentally. And agreeing with the aspects of this emphasis, this vision is arguing that psychology and science cannot be generally understood as impersonal process implementing automations, but should be individually a human process. It is true that the process of individuality and a way of doing science and psychology, then Christians will shape and should shape the very facet of people's faith in doing psychology. This makes an intensive discussion of virtues that should be a long mediation of integration of psychological theories as focused on personal transformational Christian psychology. This includes an extensive discussion of the virtues that are characterized by the Christian faith, as this embodies the Christian's calling to imagine or embodying in the flesh. This is shown in a Christian counselor's work as godly counsel is done within God's concerns. Such an embodiment is the likeness of God is understood as intertwined with the truth of nature, which is transformed in transformation with God's work of sanctification. Individualism is a great strength and great weakness of evangelism, but individual focus ensures that Christians take the call to follow Christ personally. This means that Christians doing psychology take individual piety seriously, that each Christian understands the call to pick up the cross and follow Christ for the sake of the call. The darker side of this emphasis in individualism and its manifested yet continual splintering or fragmenting parts of the Protestant movement of evangelical churches and ministries in particular, the freedom or responsibility to respond personally sometimes becomes a license that ignores the communal integrity within the body of Christ. In ignoring our obligation to seek unity, the engagers or type of hubris imagines we can ignore wisdom. We see this in the labors of past generations of believers whose theology and understanding of life are a gift from God. Coe and Hall show considerable freedom from the past Christian psychology. Jarringly contrast Roberts and Watson's mastery of the great course of Christian psychology in the past. In the focus of transformational psychology, the psychology shows a fundamental principle, but Cole and Hall risk disagreeing with other psychologists about ways to formulate psychological degenerating psychology into a spirituality transformed yet mature context model. Coe and Hall may be gracious in their endeavor to transform psychology, but in disagreeing with what must be asked if they are in line for failure, not being truly spiritually transformed, makes no mistake finding the right to invoke arguments on what is truly transformative. Romans 1 speaks of a willing moral blindness, preventing those in bondage to see from seeing the world in a right manner. The New Testament letters contain arguments that boil down to a variant of Paul's asserting those who are spiritually mature, it is right. It is not necessarily non-apostles invoking such reasoning, but seeking a constructive manner of doing psychology, as one aspect redeems. Colleagues Coe and Hall make no such allegation of spiritual transformational psychology that is to be fundamental in bringing Christian faith and psychology together. For this happens must become the fundamental product of individualism and spiritual psychology. Another concern lies in the indirect criticism of unidentified approaches to understanding Coe and Hall's Christian's foundational aspect being merely assumptions instead of actual knowledge. Further, a Christian's transformational psychology does not merely assume certain Christian beliefs to be true, but rather a Christian apprehends that specific Christian realities are emphasized in their original context as being true. It is not to say that such tenets or beliefs are presupposed by means of presuppositions or processes of something which is known in the assumption of supposing it to be true. It is rather that these are true, because in corresponding or born from one's experience in reality, we are not necessarily guilty in merely assuming that certain beliefs are true because one uses such words like assumptions and presuppositions. The philosophical waters run deep in the writing of traditional Reformed epistemology, which is the study of philosophical knowledge. Such traditions recognizes that things taken as utterly or fundamentally true, such as the experience of God, may nevertheless be demonstrated in the standards or demands by atheistic counterparts. Nevertheless, Christians are still within their epistemic rights, taking such beliefs as fundamentally true in the approach to knowledge. Writers may continue to use words such as assumptions and presuppositions without giving up the truth.